At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the shooting and the killing stopped. And an almost surreal silence descended over the trenches in France and Flanders, where some 7.5 million men had died since 1914. That date, November 11th, is celebrated still as Remembrance Day in Britain and as Veterans Day in the United States. It is generally thought of as the moment World War I ended. But technically that is not true. The Germans did not surrender. Rather, they agreed to an armistice, essentially a ceasefire, that would begin that day and last for 1 month in order to discuss and resolve the issues of the war. The Allies knew how desperate Germany was for an armistice, so as a condition to granting it, they insisted that the German army withdraw from all occupied territories and pull back over the Rhine River. Germany also had to turn over 5,000 pieces of artillery, 5,000 locomotives, 150,000 railroad cars, and agree to inter almost all of her navy. 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 8 light cruisers, 50 destroyers, and all of her submarines or U-boats. That Germany agreed to such draconian terms suggests how close it was to collapse. And once having agreed, the Germans lost any bargaining leverage they might have exercised in the subsequent negotiations. In fact, German representatives were not even present during the discussions at Versailles, where the peace treaty was drafted. The ships of the German fleet, meanwhile, still officered and manned by their German crews, steamed out of port and made their way under escort by ships of the Royal Navy to an anchorage at Scapa Flow, north of Scotland, which the British had used as their principal naval base during the war. The German ships dropped anchor there and awaited word of their fate. The talk at Versailles, meanwhile, was mostly of punishment. The Allies, especially the British and French, viewed Germany as responsible for the war and believed that it must now be made to pay. Eric Geddes, the British First Lord of the Admiralty, famously said that he would squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeak. To him, that meant seizing the ships of the German Navy. Suspecting as much, the commander of the German fleet at Scapa Flow, Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, decided that it would be better if the fleet died gallantly with its colors flying. On June 21, 1919, the crews on 74 German warships in Scapa Flow opened the seacocks on their vessels and prepared to abandon ship. 52 of the ships sank. Others were run ashore by the British to prevent them from sinking. Some of the sunken ships were later salvaged. A few became target vessels, but quite a few, including a half dozen of the big battleships and battlecruisers, are still there at the bottom of the chill waters of Scapa Flow. In one day, the second largest navy in the world had ceased to exist. At Versailles, meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson strove tirelessly to convince America's co-belligerents to adopt a compromise peace. But Britain and France had suffered too much. France alone had endured nearly 2 million dead in the war, 17 times as many as the United States. Wilson's foremost goal was to create a League of Nations that he hoped would prevent future wars, and to get it, he was forced to accept a number of compromises, including punitive border adjustments and the imposition of crippling reparations on Germany. He got the League, but when he returned to the United States, he found a rising swell of opposition to it, and the Senate refused to ratify the treaty. In fact, the United States never did accept the Treaty of Versailles, and technically that meant it remained at war with Germany. To end that legal absurdity, the United States signed its own separate peace with Germany in August of 1921. Most Americans were now prepared to return to what the new president, Warren Harding, famously called normalcy. And what exactly was that for the U.S. Navy, now the second largest Navy in the world? The Naval Expansion Act of 1916 was still on the books, so the battleships and battlecruisers it had authorized remained on the building ways in various states of completion. Finishing them would make the U.S. Navy the world's largest, and by a significant margin. The only naval power that could even consider competing with it was the Royal Navy. It is possible that the British would have felt compelled to keep pace, or at least try to keep pace, and the result would have been an expensive and useless naval arms race. To address this, the new American Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, invited representatives from 9 major powers to meet in Washington. Besides Britain, those invited included Japan, which had fought on the Allied side in World War I, France, and Italy, 2 more Allied powers, plus Belgium, Portugal, the Netherlands, and China. Excluded from the conference were both Germany and Russia. The terms of the Versailles Treaty prevented Germany from rebuilding her navy, and Russia was a pariah state after having fallen to a communist revolution. The delegates met in November of 1921. Charles Evans Hughes gave the welcoming address. Most of the delegates sat back to await what they expected to be a largely pro forma and largely meaningless welcome talk. Instead, Hughes tossed out a bombshell. The United States, he declared, was prepared to destroy all 15 of the capital ships it currently had under construction, and it would scrap 15 more existing battleships, reducing the U.S. Navy to a total of 18 capital ships. It's hard to overestimate the impact this announcement had. Audible gasps were heard around the room, and Hughes wasn't finished. The Royal Navy, he said, would discontinue the construction of 4 large Hood-class battlecruisers, and it would scrap 19 of its existing battleships. Admiral Sir John Beatty, the British First Sea Lord, who had been leaning back in his chair, suddenly lurched forward, the front legs of his chair thumping audibly on the wooden floor. And there was more. Japan, Hughes declared, would cancel the planned construction of 8 new battleships, stop the construction of 7 others, and scrap 10 more. As one commentator remarked, in 30 minutes, Hughes had sunk more warships than all the admirals in all the wars in the history of the world. Some wondered if Hughes had conceded too much too soon, but he had seized the moral high ground. In the deliberations that followed, there was some niggling about substituting this ship for that ship, but by and large, the proposal he laid out on that first day formed the basis of the agreement that eventually emerged. The Washington Naval Arms Limitation Treaty of 1922 limited the major naval powers of the world to an upper limit of battleship tonnage and to a prescribed ratio of battleship strength. The famous formula was 5-5-3. That is, Britain and the United States would each have about 500,000 tons of battleships, and Japan would be allowed 300,000 tons. France and Italy were allowed 175,000 tons each. Japan felt disrespected by this formula. On a practical level, it made sense, for Japan's interests were almost exclusively in the Western Pacific, whereas Britain and the United States had interests in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, as well as the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. But it was the principle of the thing. A Japanese delegate remarked that the 553 formula was like saying Rolls-Royce, Rolls-Royce, Ford. Still, rather than risk being left out of the agreement, the Japanese accepted the terms. Significantly, the 553 formula applied only to battleships, which remained the principal index of naval power. The delegates hoped that limiting them would reduce the chances of another war. Then, too, battleships were the most expensive type of warship, so that limiting them saved everybody a lot of money. To make sure no one tried to cheat by claiming that a 20,000-ton ship with 14-inch guns was really a big destroyer, the treaty very carefully defined a battleship as any warship that displaced over 10,000 tons or had guns larger than 8 inches. Of course, that meant that over the next dozen years or so, all three of the major naval powers built what were called treaty cruisers, ships that displaced exactly 10,000 tons with guns of exactly 8 inches. One element of naval warfare that was not addressed at Washington was the submarine. During the war, German U-boats had come frighteningly close to starving Britain into surrender, and Britain suggested doing away with submarines altogether. Like germ warfare and gas warfare, submarines would be declared illegal. But France and Italy objected, insisting that submarines allowed smaller powers like them to defend themselves against the big battleship navies, so nothing was done about submarines. Even so, the 1922 agreement was the most successful arms limitation treaty in history. It forestalled an Anglo-American naval arms race and saved everyone an enormous amount of money. There was another consequence to that agreement that was not fully appreciated at the time. In order to make use of at least some of those half-finished warship hulls, the United States and Japan agreed that they could each convert 2 of them into aircraft carriers. In 1926, the Japanese launched the Kaga and Akagi, and a year later, the United States commissioned the Lexington and Saratoga. Here's why that mattered. In 1922, when the treaty was signed, aircraft carriers were still experimental. In fact, the first American aircraft carrier, the USS Langley, was commissioned that very year. She was an odd-looking vessel created by erecting a flight deck on top of the coaling ship Jupiter. Some thought her elevated flight deck made her look like an old covered wagon, which became her nickname. The Langley was relatively small, and her presumed role was to provide air support for the battle fleet. However, the new carriers that emerged from the 1922 agreement were huge, twice as big as the Langley, which made them powerful striking platforms in their own right. That changed the very function of aircraft carriers. Here's an example of what I mean. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the U.S. Navy conducted a fleet exercise every summer. It was essentially a giant war game in which the Pacific Fleet was divided into competing squadrons, which then fought each other using dummy rounds for shells and flour sacks as bombs. Judges assessed the performance of each group and made recommendations. During the fleet exercise in January 1929, officially Fleet Problem 9, William V. Pratt, the commander of one of the contending squadrons, detached the carrier Saratoga from the battleship line and sent her to attack the Panama Canal. 70 aircraft from the Saratoga dropped hypothetical bombs all over the canal's locks, and the judges ruled that they had closed the canal. Pratt's bold move showed what a carrier could accomplish when it operated independently of the battleships. Alas, the judges ruled that the Saratoga herself was subsequently sunk by opposing battleships, and the final wash-up for the exercise concluded that battleships remained the final arbiter of naval combat. Well, maybe. But the Mahanian edict that battleships were the queen of the seas was getting harder and harder to sustain. Naval warfare had now become three-dimensional. Victory was to be secured not only by battleships on the surface, but by submarines below and by aircraft above. Another concern of the U.S. Navy during the 1920s was planning for future possible conflicts. Planners on the Army-Navy Joint Board compiled a whole series of contingency plans, each of them color-coded, with the colors representing different possible enemies. Black for Germany, red for Britain, gold for France, green for Mexico, and so on. The one on which the planners lavished most of their attention was War Plan Orange for Japan. In its basic elements, Plan Orange was pretty simple. It assumed that a future war with Japan would be triggered by a Japanese assault on the Philippine Islands. If and when that happened, friendly ground forces, both American and Filipino, were to retire into the Bataan Peninsula across the bay from Manila and hold out there for 6 months while the U.S. Navy battleship fleet mobilized in Pearl Harbor, then set out to rescue them. As those ships steamed westward, it was assumed the Japanese fleet would come out to challenge them, and the result would be a Jutland-like battleship confrontation somewhere in the Western Pacific that would pretty much decide the outcome of the war. There was a lot of discussion about the precise route that the fleet would take to get from Hawaii to the Philippines. Some opted for what was called the through ticket to Manila, a direct thrust all the way across the Pacific. It was bold enough, but the logistical demands were daunting, and most planners argued that it would be necessary to seize several islands in the Central Pacific to use as bases en route to the Philippines. This, of course, was the origin of the subsequently famous island hopping campaign of 1943 and 1944. The problem was that most of those islands were in the possession of the Japanese. Japan had been an ally of Britain and France during the First World War, and her share of the spoils at Versailles was what was called the Japanese Mandate over the formerly German-held islands in the Central Pacific. One stipulation of the mandate was that Japan was not to fortify those islands, but virtually everyone assumed that was being done anyway. So if the U.S. Navy needed advanced bases in the Central Pacific, they would have to be taken from the Japanese. And this was where the United States Marine Corps came in. During the First World War, the Marines had fought on the Western Front under their own commanders. They had fought boldly and effectively, but functioned essentially as infantry. They would argue that they did it better than the infantry, and they may have been right. But after the war, Congress wondered why the country had to maintain two separate organizations if the Army and the Marines were essentially doing the same job. Eager to maintain their independence, Marine Corps leaders sought to identify a specific skill set that would justify their continued existence. The answer, of course, was amphibious assault. Here was a complex and difficult element of warfare that required specialized training. In 1921, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Earl Ellis, known universally as Pete, produced a paper entitled Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. From that moment on, amphibious assault became the particular property of the United States Marine Corps. As the Navy adjusted to the new role of aircraft carriers and the Marine Corps embraced amphibious operations, the rest of the nation, and indeed the rest of the world, partied on toward economic disaster in 1929. The deal made at Versailles was a major contributor. Britain and France had insisted on heavy financial reparations from Germany, and Germany had to borrow at least some of the money from U.S. banks. Britain and France then used that money to buy American goods. From the U.S. to Germany, to Britain, and back to the U.S., this grand tour of the dollar worked as long as it was not interrupted. Fueled in part by the peripatetic dollar, the United States stock market rose dramatically throughout the 1920s, and not wanting to be left out, Americans bet heavily on its continued rise. When stock prices plunged in October 1929, it ruined many U.S. investors, but it also broke the grand tour of the dollar. U.S. banks stopped lending to Germany. Germany stopped paying reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France stopped buying American goods. The whole global economy collapsed like a house of cards. Naturally, governments tried to halt the slide. The conventional response was to cut spending. That squeezed the money supply even further and made things worse. By 1931, the Western world was mired in a depression. Meanwhile, representatives of the world's naval powers met again to see if they could engineer another limitation on naval arms. They met in London in 1930. And while they did succeed in limiting the number of cruisers, employing a formula similar to the one they had enacted in Washington, they failed to come to any meaningful agreement about submarines other than to urge that they be used humanely, whatever that meant. Nor did they come to any agreement concerning aircraft carriers. Germany had not been invited to the Washington Conference 8 years earlier, nor was it invited to this one. After all, her Navy was limited by the terms of the Versailles Agreement. That, however, proved to be an unreliable bulwark. Many Germans believed they had gotten a raw deal at Versailles, and in 1930, a new German political party was insisting that its terms should be ignored. The party's name was a mouthful: Nationalsozialist Deutschland Arbeitenpartei. So most people referred to it using just the first two syllables of the first word, National, or Nazi. When the Nazi Party won 37% of the vote in the 1932 elections, it became part of the governing coalition. Its leader, Adolf Hitler, made cooperation conditional on his becoming chancellor. Once in office, he quickly suppressed all democratic trappings and made himself dictator, Führer. Some in the West welcomed this new muscular Germany in the hope that its reviving economy would help fuel a wider economic recovery. Others hoped that a stronger Germany would be a useful counterweight against communist Russia. That is why Britain, in 1935, agreed to a unilateral adjustment to the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Without consulting France, it signed an Anglo-German naval agreement that freed Germany to build a navy that was 35% the size of the Royal Navy. The agreement even allowed Germany to begin constructing the first German submarines since 1918. It was a foot in the door for German naval rearmament. The German Navy also got a new name. Formerly the Reichsmarine, or National Navy, it was now rechristened the Kriegsmarine, War Navy. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, had not even bothered to keep up with the limits imposed on it by the two naval treaties. A parsimonious Congress had starved it of funds, and after the stock market crash, it cut spending even more. Then in 1933, the same year Hitler consolidated power in Germany, Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office as the 32nd President of the United States. FDR, as he was almost universally known, had been a naval man all his life. He had learned to sail almost as soon as he could walk, and he had served as Woodrow Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. Like his sixth cousin and uncle by marriage, Theodore Roosevelt, he was an enthusiastic champion of an expanded Navy. One of FDR's early acts as president was to funnel $238 million of public works funds to naval construction. And the next year, he backed legislation to bring the U.S. Navy up to the limits allowed by the Washington and London treaties. 2 years after that, he convinced Congress to fund 2 more aircraft carriers and 6 heavy cruisers that had been authorized back in 1929, but which had never been built due to the Depression. Japanese-American relations, already precarious, took a marked turn for the worse in 1937 after Japan invaded China, provoking American calls for a ceasefire. The Japanese assault on the Chinese city of Nanking resulted in heavy loss of civilian life and especially angered Americans. That same year, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank a U.S. Navy gunboat, the Panay, that had been operating on the Yangtze River. FDR accepted the Japanese apology, but he also asked for yet another naval expansion. In May 1938, Congress agreed to a 20% across-the-board increase in the size of the U.S. Navy. The outbreak of war in Europe in September of 1939 greatly complicated American naval planning, as in 1914, the U.S. at once declared itself neutral. By a wide margin, Americans were absolutely determined to stay out of this war. FDR, however, believed that America's own security was tied up in Britain's survival and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. And he did all he could, short of outright belligerency, to aid the Anglo-French allies. The fall of France in June 1940 was a profound shock. So much so that Congress agreed to make still more naval preparations to defend the Western Hemisphere in the event of a German victory. Less than a month after the French capitulation, Congress voted the single largest naval appropriation in American history. It was called the Two-Ocean Navy Act, and it authorized no fewer than 257 new warships, including an astonishing 18 new aircraft carriers. This was the fleet that would eventually win the war in the Pacific. Another consequence of the French defeat was a reorientation of American war planning. The American Chief of Naval Operations in 1940 was Admiral Harold Stark, known by his Academy nickname as Betty. In considering how to adjust U.S. naval planning to the startling new circumstances, Stark proposed a near reversal of the Orange Plan. He argued that Hitler's Germany posed by far the greater danger to U.S. security. For one thing, German armies had already occupied France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Norway. For another, Germany's gross domestic product was more than double Japan's. If war came, Stark argued, the United States Navy should concentrate on defeating Germany first before turning its attention to Japan. Roosevelt agreed. And just months before Pearl Harbor, Germany first became the official U.S. doctrine. The new focus was evident in events in the North Atlantic, where, as in the last war, German U-boats were savaging Allied convoys carrying goods from Canada and the United States to Britain. Roosevelt responded, first by establishing what he called neutrality patrols out to 200 miles from the American East Coast. Then he gradually expanded those patrols until American destroyers were effectively escorting the convoys. Inevitably, perhaps, that led to a number of confrontations between U.S. destroyers and German U-boats, even though officially, at least, the United States was still neutral in the war. On Halloween night in 1941, the destroyer Reuben James was screening a British convoy south of Iceland when she was struck by a torpedo fired by a German U-boat. The ensuing explosion touched off the ship's magazine, and she went down with the loss of 115 men. The politically sensitive Roosevelt knew that even after this, the public would not support a declaration of war, and Hitler was unwilling to add the United States to his list of enemies until the Wehrmacht defeated the Red Army in Russia. War was coming nonetheless, and soon, though it arrived not in the Atlantic, but on the other side of the world at a place called Pearl Harbor.